Hi, welcome back to the channel. Michelle, and today I'm going to be joining in a collab video. So in this collab, I will be joining Kara, the mama librarian, Jill from Patterson Academy, and today we're going to be talking about how we assess learning in homeschooling. And I think this is a great topic to discuss and a great topic to get perspectives on, because how do we gauge our children's learning in homeschooling? I think a lot of people assume, testing, and what is testing? What is assessing? I think a lot of people assume those are like the multiple choice questions or the tests at the end of a chapter. I think there's a lot more to it than that, or standardized testing. There's a lot more to assessing our kids' learning than just those things. I do think those things can be tools, but I think there's more to it than that. So I think assessing my kids' learning. So if you're new to my channel, I have 3 children. I have a 12-year-old, 8-year-old, and a 5-year-old. And we've been homeschooling, 4 years now. This is our 4th year. And we've assessed throughout these years. It's not something we just do at the end of the year. It's not something we just do in the middle of the year. A lot of the things we use, a lot of the curriculum, the resources we use have this built into them. So for me, assessing my kids' learning, seeing how they're progressing, if they're understanding the concepts, if they're retaining the information, really helps me make adjustments as their teacher, as their educator. It helps me to realize when things need to be changed, or very importantly, when I need to change my teaching strategies, because there's a lot of it that is on our part too. And I think having assessments built in to kind of check both yourself and your student to see where they are is really important and helps you. It's a tool as a teacher. And it helps me teach my individual students, because although, we're in the same family and everything, they're each very uniquely different and have different needs. And being able to see where those specific needs are comes from those different assessment opportunities. So first, let's start is, what do I consider assessing in homeschool? Or how do I assess my learning? So for me, it's not just my kids' learning. It's not just being able to, do the multiple choice question and get it right. That was very much my education. I was public school education. I was taught to the test, and that's not something I want for my children, but that does not mean I remove the testing from my homeschool education, because I do think there's ways to test for understanding of the concept. Do they have a foundational understanding of it? Can they apply that to the bigger picture? I think that is really important, because especially with my education, I was taught, this, take a test, pass, move on. But I want more. I want them to be able to, especially in things like history and math, see the connections of why we're learning this now and how it relates to something later. To make those bigger picture connections is really important. So for me to do that, to make sure that they're not just progressing, just not getting that concept and moving on, I need to have things in place to evaluate that. So one of the ways I do this is the vast majority of curriculum I use has this already included in the curriculum. So for example, dimensions math, we've used this since my oldest came home for homeschool in 3rd grade, and my 8-year-old has used it from the beginning. My youngest is using math with confidence, and then he will, like his sisters, eventually go into dimensions as well. But what I really like this is it comes in 3 parts: textbook, workbook, and test book. So the idea is the textbook is something you do together. So you're teaching the lesson. It's laid out where you teach the concept, whatever is being taught for that specific chapter. Then you have some practice problems you do together. So it's the I do, I teach the lesson, we practice some of the problems, and then comes in the they do, the independent work, the workbook that they have assigned, because I don't make them do all the pages, because dimensions is ridiculously long, unless I notice that there is some concepts being missed. So I will go through in my weekly prep on Saturdays for the following week. I read my lesson, I prepare myself to teach, so I understand what's going on, and then I will mark their pages for the workbook of what I want them to do. And when they go to do this independently, if they have questions, of course they ask, but most of it is done independently. That shows me what they're capable of. What did they learn from the concept? Are they able to do it themselves? Because I do think that's important. And there's nothing wrong with them needing help or not getting it to the point where they can do it completely independent, but they need to practice those skills of independence when it comes to work, because they will eventually reach a point where mom and dad or whoever, the guardian, isn't sitting right next to them helping them. They're going to have to, if they go into high school, college, jobs, all those things, they're going to have to learn how to navigate these things themselves. So I think practicing these skills at the early age, and just working your way up to that level of independence is really important. But like I said, if they do the workbook, and I check it immediately, all of our work we do usually gets checked during lunch, like their math and language arts and things that they do without me. I will check during lunch and give immediate feedback. So it's not being lost. It's not like I'm waiting for the end of the week to check things. They get immediate feedback so we can make corrections when necessary. But if I'm going through the workbook and I've noticed that a specific concept or the entire thing is wrong, I can immediately address that problem right there and do the lesson, or most likely approach it from a different perspective than I was before. So adjusting to meet that child's needs. But that gives me immediate feedback of whether or not they're understanding the concept. And one thing I love, but also hate about Dimensions, is that it asks questions in such a complicated way. It's not straightforward, but it asks them in a way that you have to understand the concept in order to do the problem. There's no squeaking by. With Dimensions problems, you have to understand it, which I kind of like because you really need to know your stuff, but it's also really frustrating because it's a super complicated problem that usually has like 4 steps in it. But again, there's good and bad to that, but it gives me immediate feedback. And then with the test booklet, again, I really like this. After every chapter, there's 2 tests. There's test A and test B. Test A is usually more of, multiple choice, fill in the blank type things, while test B will be more word problems, and they tend to be more difficult. But that will kind of help me narrow down where they're having issues, if they're having issues, or if they're completely fine and we can move on. There's also cumulative review in here, which we use as well. So once you've gotten through a certain number of chapters, you go back, because Dimensions is not, in my opinion, does not do a very good job with review. Because it's a mastery program, so you're learning a concept, you're testing, you might not see that concept for another couple weeks, and it's easy for it to kind of go away. But again, noticing that my kids were having issues remembering certain things helps me, as the educator, be able to supplement when necessary. So for example, this past year, I noticed that my oldest was having some difficulty with her 7 and 8 multiplication tables. For some reason, those had just flown out of her head. So that told me to bring those back in to help with her math, because she'd get the entire problem. She'd follow all the steps correctly, but it would be wrong because she accidentally did not multiply 6 times 7 correctly because something went wrong. But that tells me as the educator, okay, I need to go back and she needs to review that. That is a helping tool. Same thing with how I talk about how Dimensions didn't have enough review in it. I brought in Math Mammoth Skills, which is, you can buy it by grade level, and they would do a sheet of that every day. And it's just review practice, because we don't want our kids to just learn it and move on. We want them to be able to retain the information. In order to retain the information, you have to be exposed to it more than once. It's something you have to come back to for your neural pathways to actually be solidified. So that's an example of kind of like the curriculum I use. Another one I think that is really big is core knowledge. We've used this pretty much everything core knowledge has used, I've dabbled in. I have videos on that if you want to see. But for example, my youngest, my 5-year-old, he's doing the kindergarten level right now. Core knowledge within it, and again, it's meant more for a public school setting, so I know a lot of people are like, oh, testing, assessments, I want to get away from that. They do have a purpose in education, though. They do have a purpose in helping you as the teacher aid your student in learning. So for example, in the kindergarten level, there are units. So we are currently on the plant unit. Within that plant unit, there's pausing points. So that's just where you bring in trade books, you do different hands-on activities. There's also domain assessments. So at the end of each of these units, you have a test. But for example, in his grade level, that test is, pictures. He has to circle the picture. But again, this is developing those test-taking skills. And that is a skill that's actually really necessary, especially in high school. Granted, homeschoolers can go different paths. That's completely true. If you take the ACT or SAT, you're going to have to know how to take a test. Even if you go into trade school, guess what? To get your license, you're going to have to take a test. And that's a skill that needs to be practiced. So I feel the more we can practice that at an age-appropriate level, the better our kids have in understanding, retaining, and also being able to do well. So for him, he just did the domain assessment. So for example, this one was, and we did it pointing, he was given questions about what parts soaks up the water, things like that. Where are the seeds located? He would point to those types of things. And this is an example of, okay, we were talking about plants and how they can give us different things. So he had to go through and figure out, you know, French fries come from a potato type things. It's not super complicated. It's not beyond what he's capable of, but it's getting him to like think back, okay, what did I learn? And be able to retain and take that information. And this one was something about trees. But again, it's all in the teacher guide. But that's just a simple example of how I take assessments for younger kids, and that's naturally in core knowledge. They have a lot of review, they have a lot of assessment opportunities. For example, we're using core knowledge United States history this year for our history. And I brought this out because, again, they have the mid-year review, they have the end of the year review. So one thing that's really nice about this is that they have scheduled practice time, so review time, which I really appreciate in their schedule, that much like in a public school setting, you review before finals, right? Or you review the information you went over. This is in this as well. So we had our end of the year assessment, volume 1, and this covered pre-colonial to 1800. So you can see there's multiple choice in here. There's vocabulary. Well, what's really nice about the core knowledge is there's also bigger picture. So taking what you learn and applying it to this. So for example, they had to, the importance of history, they had to pick a particular event in history and how it impacted today and how it's relevant today. Again, that's that bigger picture. So you're getting the traditional fill in the blank, because honestly, we're talking about a huge chunk of time in history that it's really hard to openly just discuss that. You need to know some basic information in history in order to be able to do some of the larger picture stuff. So I am fine with having review like this. I think it's good practice for them to take a test in this type of format. It doesn't stress them out, they're used to it. But also I get that more bigger picture with the review questions or the essay questions at the end. And again, within the core knowledge, especially the United States history, there's those questions within while you're reading it. It's a lot of discussion, but it also has the opportunity to gauge their learning. And after going through the entire, first volume, I was curious to actually know how much my kids retained. And they did really well. They got a B on it. And another thing we did for core knowledge, we did Blessings of Liberty as part of our social justice unit this year. And it was, their assignment for the entire thing was to, in the end, write a persuasive speech about a social justice topic that they were passionate about. And we learned how to give a speech, we learned how to organize a speech, how to stand, how to speak, all those things. One of the things I thought was really cool in there is it had a fluency assessment, not just a reading fluency, but like giving a speech where you correctly pronounce and enunciate the words. And I did this, and they had in the teacher guide how you score it. And I was curious because I've never tested my daughter, my oldest, on something like that. She does, very well in language arts naturally, but I didn't know if she was on par with her peers when it came to public speaking skills. And she did. She scored really well with it, and it gave you all the stuff to do it and the rubric to assess it. But again, those are really helpful. Same thing with core knowledge in the younger years. It has reading assessments within it. So it really did help me pinpoint an issue my son was having with reading. And I was able to adjust to that. Another thing in that persuasive speech was it gives the students a rubric, which I think is really important that kids understand how they're being evaluated. And that's something that, in high school and college, you get the syllabus, and with that comes what the teacher's expectations are for you. I think if kids understand our expectations, they are more easily able to hit them and exceed them. So they got this before they got given their speech. And again, I adjusted it age-wise. Obviously, my 8-year-old, I'm going over it with her verbally, while my 12-year-old can actually read it herself and figure out the things she needs. And then they gave their persuasive speeches, and I gave them a grade based on that. That is a wonderful learning opportunity. And spoiler, core knowledge is completely free. So if you're looking for assessment opportunities, I really do like core knowledge as one because it's naturally built in. And again, it's not about right versus wrong, but having opportunities to assess their learning, what they're retaining, and the bigger picture. So what happens when you have curriculum that doesn't have those built-in assessments? So for example, we do art and philosophy as some of our electives this year. Those aren't exactly, test taking. You could, of course, have multiple choice, like which philosopher said this. But with philosophy, I don't think that lends itself very well to what you need to assess. So for that, it's mainly discussion-based. So this past week, we're doing the short, curly philosophy book right now, and it was talking about immortality and would you want to live forever, and it goes through different, philosophical thoughts on that. And my kids being able to, especially at this age, bring out their own opinions and ideas and what they think life and death and happiness and joy. These are some really bigger picture ideas that can't necessarily be assessed on a piece of paper, and that's completely fine. But being able to have these conversations, I can see that they're developing their own thoughts. It's not going to be something as simple as math or maybe language arts or grammar where there's an easier way to assess that, but that's kind of on you as the teacher to have that skill set as well. So same thing with art, there's no right and wrong when it comes to art, but we do, learn different art concepts and practice those art concepts in our curriculum. And then they learn, the principles of art, of critiquing art. So if we were looking at art, what elements of art do you see? So they're able to kind of take the information they learned and look at their artwork and say, okay, well, I can see I used curved lines here. Why did I use curved lines there? So it's kind of developing those skills over time. So it's not just about filling out the worksheets and getting them right. It's really assessing that larger picture, that bigger picture thinking. And so another curriculum we use is Lightning Lecture. This does not have tests in it, but it does have review within it, which I think is really important. So we should be looking for resources that have review put in them, because in order for the kids to learn and retain, they're going to have to come back to the concept again, not just once. And in this, especially since we've used Lightning Literature for my oldest from the beginning, her 3rd grade, she is revisiting concepts, and the same thing is true with core knowledge. It builds upon itself. So she's layering that learning based on years of using the same curriculum, that she's learning a little bit more every time she visits it again, but that visiting it again helps with retention and the understanding and the bigger picture understanding of that. So I think especially in 6th grade level, we're not, just answering comprehension questions. There are comprehension questions in here so they understand what's going on in the story, but some bigger picture analysis is happening. They're not just reading the book, they're assessing the book for themselves. They're looking for themes, they're looking for character development. They're doing this higher level thinking now than they were in the younger grades. But again, to be able to do that, you need to be able to work up to that. So that's kind of one of my biggest resources, is I use the curriculum as a tool. Obviously, I hear that a ton on homeschooling channels. Curriculum is a tool, but you have to know how to use that tool. You need to have to know how to assess if your child's learning, if there's a struggle, because often, honestly, if there's a struggle, a lot of people need to go to something else and they think something is wrong with the curriculum. It's not always the curriculum. Sometimes it's just an adjustment you need to make. Sometimes it's your teaching strategies that need to change, but you will not know what the cause is unless you have those opportunities to assess, because it's like a dartboard. If you're just guessing, you're throwing darts in the air hoping you hit the target. But if you have tools at your ready to kind of figure out, okay, it's this specific area, and diving deeper into it, you can make those adjustments a lot easier, and it saves you a lot of time, energy, and money than just constantly switching. So to the idea of pen to paper, I know a lot of people are big fans of just verbal dictation, narration, those types of things. Again, nothing against those. Those are included in core knowledge. That might surprise you that a lot of the discussion is that type of thing. But I do think it is a skill, like I kind of briefly talked about earlier, of kids being able to put pen to paper and answer the questions. It is a skill that will come in handy in high school, college, your career, whatever it might be. You can't just always verbally explain your answers. You need to be able to actually physically put it. Because one thing I've noticed, especially with my oldest, the way we speak is different than the way we write, and it should be. We shouldn't be writing it exactly the way we speak, because that wouldn't be very good writing, honestly. We need to be able to take our ideas, formulate, our thesis statements and all those things that, are so boring, but we need to be able to collect our thoughts, have evidential support for those thoughts, being able to condense it into these ideas so we can better explain to people our reasoning and things behind those. And you can't just hand a kid, in 6th, 7th, 8th grade, be like, okay, here we go, we're gonna get textual evidence for this. No, it's something that needs to be built upon over the years, and those things are built upon by learning these assessment skills throughout. And that, not seeing it as this is assessing whether you're smart or you're dumb or anxiety or anything like that. This is our opportunity to learn. So every year, my kids, starting last year, we started doing map testing. And I explain map testing to my kids in this way. It's a standardized test that it helps me assess what we've learned, what we need to work on, and it's a tool for me as a teacher. So a lot of it is put on me, and honestly, I think most of the accountability should be put on me, because at the end of the year, if my kids haven't progressed, they haven't learned, that's on me. That's my responsibility. I took that responsibility on when I chose to homeschool. So they don't see their standardized testing as stressful at all. And I don't prep them for it. I don't give them comprehension workbooks or whatever test workbooks. I think you really want to practice test taking skills in the context of what you're already learning, not having separate workbooks for it, not just prepping them for multiple choice questions. They should be able to build these skills through the curriculum and the resources you're already using. That learning out of context, I don't think is really helpful. And you can see that with a lot of the curriculum I use, that a lot of it is learning through context. But with the map testing, I'll link above how that went, because I do think it was really important. I think it's a really important teaching tool as well. Like I've said throughout this entire video, it really helps you gauge where your kids are, really helps you gauge if they progress. So for example, my oldest, and I talk about that in that video, she's in 6th grade, but she's doing Dimensions 5, because when I brought her home and the gaps that I had to address, she's a level behind her grade level. But I wanted to see how she compared to her peers, and she was right on track for where she should be, even though we are at a different level. But the nice thing about the map testing is it broke down areas she could work on or areas she was weaker in. And it's funny because a lot of the questions she missed are just concepts we hadn't gone over yet in math, and I know that because I teach her math. So I know that, this specific decimal related question she got wrong because we hadn't covered that yet. So that tells me that although she missed this question, it's not because she doesn't understand it, it's because we haven't gotten to it yet. And another thing with grammar, with her, I noticed that there was mechanics with writing. That is something that she needed to work on because she was not at level for her age, which again, I wouldn't have been attuned to unless I had her take that test, because she's my oldest child. I don't know the exact amount of, when a child should be using the mechanics perfectly in their paper. It's a learning experience for both of us. So this tells me that, hey, I need to supplement. We did this past year. We supplemented some mechanics of writing for her to build up those skills. Same thing with my youngest, who took the math and reading assessment. The reading assessment, I was really curious for her because that's an area she struggles in. And it has literally taken us years to get to a point where she's fluently reading and comfortable and growing in her reading. But she did really, really well on that. And again, the tools of the test, the report I get back helps me narrow down the areas that they are weaker in or need supplementation in. And the nice thing about the map testing, it literally gives you worksheets to work on those specific skills, which for me is really helpful, knowing that, just getting a printout that they're weaker in this skill. Okay, but how do I help them? What can I do to supplement or help them in that area they're weaker in? And it gives you examples, which is perfect for my brain because I can go from there and again, throughout the year, give them these review opportunities to practice those skills they're weaker at, but also acknowledge the areas that they're really strong in. So I think that standardized testing is really helpful, and it can help you as the teacher kind of gauge where you can make adjustments. And sometimes I think, honestly, we're just too close to the situation to always see something that, especially if we don't have an educational background, if we haven't taught, hundreds of kids before, This is a learning experience for us too, so we should see it as a tool to help us be better teachers. And like I said before, if our kids aren't progressing the way they're supposed to, if they're not making any type of upward progress, we really need to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, okay, maybe it's not the curriculum, maybe it's not this, maybe it's something I'm doing and I need to do better in this area. It is a way for us to check ourselves, to have our own accountability, and be better for our kids, because honestly, that's what it's about. It's about providing the best education for the child you have in front of you, and in order to do that, you need to know what their needs are. You need to be able to know how to get that information to them in the best way possible, and you also need accountability as the educator to make sure you're doing those things so it's less of a struggle for everybody. But that is kind of my thoughts on how I assess, or what assessing is in homeschooling, how I assess my learning. The resources I use, the curriculum that I think does a really good job throughout the year. And again, it's not just these random, test things. It's periodically throughout the year, we were reviewing and going over information and making sure it's, they can retrieve the information. Retrieval practice is really important, but also they have the bigger picture understanding of it. And I do think bringing in resources like standardized testing is very beneficial for a teacher as well as a student, that we can really use those results and the information we get back to make adjustments, or whether it be to our curriculum, whether it be to our teaching strategy, whatever is needed, it's a tool to help us be better educators. So I will again link the other videos down below, and I encourage you to check them out because I do think assessing our learning in homeschool is important. If you have any specific questions about anything I mentioned, let me know in the comments down below. If not, thank you for watching.